I think, I mean, the context for how Canada looks at Burma is one in which Canadians have a deep interest in the country. We have for a long time. Our foreign policy puts a high emphasis on trying to help those achieving reform in the country. And the Government of Canada, I know, monitors the situation very, very closely. Our Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, our new Foreign Minister, John Baird, are closely involved in the process. So any development of this nature is the subject of considerable scrutiny and attention. You're right in your earlier comments that this is a dynamic time for Burma. That's perhaps self-evident. I think what's remarkable now is the pace of new developments. Certainly, the NLD decision to change its stance that it had only a short time ago, going into the last national elections, is quite a momentous one. From our point of view, ultimately, we will respect the decisions of the NLD, others in the parliamentary opposition, the democratic movement widely. We respect the decisions of all those who are committing themselves to reform and progress to make the decisions that they need under the circumstances. That said, or at least speaking as ambassador to Myanmar, Canadian ambassador to Myanmar, I think it's exciting that they're embracing the opportunity to try to influence the process. I think that does reflect that there are some important changes and new opportunities. It's the beginning of the beginning, as some have said, but every journey requires a start of some footsteps, and I think there have been a number of really important ones. We know there are also vulnerabilities. We know that some President Thein Sein, with whom I've spoken when I presented credentials to him only in July, surprised me with his openness to discuss sensitive issues. He addressed some important sensitive issues in a very bold way in his inauguration speech in August. There was, I think, much warranted skepticism over the sincerity at that time, but he's come through on certain things. But the vulnerabilities also involve those in the system who may not share the vision of his inauguration speech. Changes is difficult, and after multiple generations of quite an oppressive environment, I think that inevitably there will also be some in the system that will be threatened by this change. So I think the more that we can collectively embrace the opportunities that do exist, to try to push it forward, to try to recognize and acknowledge those who are trying to move the country forward, I think that's a positive opportunity, and I think the NLD's decision is certainly a very important one. I think when Aung San Suu Kyi was released after so many years of house arrest, she had to go through her own process of reacquainting herself with a changing Burmese society. I've been going in and out of the country now for a couple of years, have spent a lot of time, many hours, talking to those formally involved in the democratic process, ordinary Burmese, farmers, small business owners. And it's a society which has now evolved to the point, partly reflecting the technology of the 21st century, partly reflecting government's own policies and approaches. There is a space now for civil society clearly to articulate its views, to organize themselves to some extent, to have views at least with one another. It's a robust, very energetic civil environment where everybody has an opinion, they go up and down, but I think that's very fertile ground for a broad-based democratic movement to express itself. So Aung San Suu Kyi is a vital voice, but I think she's also very aware that she's not everybody's voice, and I think some of the gestures she's made to reach out to a wider coalition of organizations, to respect the diversity of views, is a very healthy one, and I think a very compelling and mature one. But it's quite a dynamic environment within the country, and I think supported to some extent by the great reporting that Mizamat does. I mean, people are surprisingly well informed, ordinary people, and certainly those involved in trying to foster change. I mean, as Canada's ambassador to Myanmar, I've said publicly that's a decision that we hope ASEAN will not take lightly. We've had discussions across ASEAN governments, urging them to deliberate very carefully, to use this as an opportunity as a rare opportunity to foster change before they make decisions. But ultimately, Canada recognizes that this is an ASEAN decision. It's not a Canadian decision. It's not a UN decision. It's one that they have to make themselves, that they have to be accountable for. They've made this decision now, and I understand the decision. But I think now the work really starts to try to capitalize on it. There's still considerable time to urge Myanmar to advance and broaden the reforms it claims to be committed to. I think countries like Thailand that we're in, but the 9 ASEAN countries beyond Burma all have a role to play. We will be, and others will be, encouraging them to take that role seriously. There will be decisions down the line that Canada will have to make, whether we participate in some of the ASEAN fora and processes which we put a high priority on. We'll take those decisions when the time comes, reflecting upon whether we believe the government of Myanmar has taken its responsibilities seriously and has moved forward with the reforms it claims to be committed to. I mean, it's a very timely question, and one that arises frequently. I've discussed this issue internally and with other like-mindeds, with other governments, Western governments that have sanctions similar to ours. And I think ultimately there's a consensus that by establishing criteria that are visible and presented in advance, there's a risk that becomes a minimalist position. There's also a risk that those criteria will be addressed, but then other new issues will emerge. So Canada is very hesitant to draw a list of specific criteria like a menu to say these are the check boxes we need and then we will drop sanctions. Ultimately there are certain elements that we think are vital, and we have consistently said that the release of all political prisoners is an important precondition. A serious approach to negotiating peace and autonomy and coexistence with ethnic groups which are now involved in conflict with the regime is another one. But ultimately, change in Burma after some 50 years of autocratic and fairly repressive government is not going to change with a switch of a button or a switch. And it's some of this will take time simply because there's a lack of trust, there's a lack of goodwill. Decisions have to be more than words. Decisions have to be more than an overnight action. It has to be sustained, enduring, and there has to be a sincerity that has to be earned after so much time. And these are hard to put down as criteria in advance, as a bit of a scorecard. So Canada is committed to acknowledging change that has happened and to encouraging more of it. We want to be constructive, we want to engage, we want to be realistic, but I don't think we want to set out a roadmap in advance as a target that could become a minimalist one and actually paradoxically become a constraint to reform. I think history has taught us now very clearly that countries in complex regions with many neighbors, that they benefit, their societies benefit, broader regional peace, security, economics, and prosperity all benefit when there's a consensus of approach, and when all relevant neighbors, when all countries with a stake in a particular country are involved, contributing, have a buy-in, and recognize that they have responsibilities but also opportunities to work together. I think when countries in the neighborhood are divided, it's much harder to advance development, but also to maintain issues of peace, security, in all of its various manifestations. I too have seen that in Afghanistan, with its half a dozen neighbors, all with competing interests, and we all recognize that each country has a role to play, because if you have different agendas, the job's going to be a lot harder. Absolutely. I mean, Canada has very strong relations with all of Burma's neighbors. Here in Thailand, China, India, these are important bilateral relationships for us. We cooperate with them multilaterally. I was in Beijing talking just after my arrival here to senior levels about Burma and Afghanistan, because I was just in transition. We have to engage. We have to engage with ASEAN as a whole, with each of the individual ASEAN countries to try to urge as much of a common approach as possible. And we certainly cannot neglect the dialogue that we all have to have with the countries that have a significant influence and current activities in the country. That's paramount, and I think that will only become more important as the situation hopefully continues to evolve. I think anybody who looks at Burma and thinks anything's going to happen quickly does so at their peril. I mean, we just do not have any reason to believe that that situations that complex, with roots so deep, are going to rectify themselves fast. I would not say it's not possible, and I think that should always be our goal. But I think we should recognize that that these situations are very complicated and do have these historical antecedents, and particularly the lack of trust among the players. I mean, the government is not going to be able to say, we're going to pull back today and we want you to take these countermeasures immediately, because people do not trust the government to do what they say they're going to do, to be sincere, and they are justified to have that lack of trust. Eventually, they're going to have to start moving forward and making gestures as well. But I think to expect that to happen immediately, comprehensively, would probably not be entirely realistic. It's going to be a process of trust building, of establishing sincerity, of establishing credentials, and step by step, hopefully building that foundation of peace that will sustain Burma well into the future on a much different path than it is now. Well, one of the remarkable observations I've made in my various trips inside Burma over the last couple of years, and I visited quite isolated locations. What's so remarkable to me is the presence in the most unlikely places of satellite discs, of access to media, access to broadcasting in particular, radio and television. So there's absolutely no doubt in my mind that the work that organizations like MISMA do have had a tangible and vital impact in bringing information to individuals that otherwise wouldn't get it. But it's also been encouraging because they realize they're not alone, and that there's no reason to give up on their wishes and their aspirations, because much of the world stands with them, prepared to help them, and prepared to travel on this journey together with them. So I think it's been instrumental in keeping the spirit of democracy and human aspirations alive. So I really I can't say enough about how I think important that role has been. Well, like the elections of last November, I mean, the Constitution is deeply flawed. The process that resulted in the Constitution is deeply flawed. That Constitution is that Constitution is a constraint on further development. I think what's important is that all sides are open to constitutional change. There seems to be, in that inauguration speech in April, a signal that of some new openness on the part of the government. There's increasing vocabulary and dialogue, which seems to suggest that the situation is not a static one, and I think that's the most important thing. Well, I think anybody who dedicates themselves to Southeast Asia needs to be an optimist. I think if one wanted to be negative, if one wanted to be pessimistic, one can look around every day and find reasons to justify pessimism. But I do think there are reasons for optimism, genuine reasons for optimism. I think the main one is the spirit of the Burmese people themselves. I mean, they have, with 50 years of very, very difficult governance and widespread deep poverty, I think the positive spirit that I see among rich and poor and across the ethnic mosaic that makes up Burma, when I talk to ordinary people, my spirits tend to be lifted. I think change will come. I think it will be good change. The key question is when and how long it will take. But I am optimistic that Burma will one day take its rightful role in the constellation of nations as a proud democracy where its people have the government and the society that they deserve.